Well, welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. Now, according to our next guest, Oby Ezekwesili, the COVID-19 pandemic has dealt with a severe injury to Africa's development prospects, and it's worsened the conditions of its poor and vulnerable.
And as a result, she expects that the continent be accorded damages and liability compensation from China. She's joining us now to speak on her opinion piece in the Washington Post, among other matters. It's good to have you, Ms. Oby Ezekwesili, right now on the morning show. Thanks for joining us. Now, let's begin with that Washington Post op-ed where you believe that China owes Nigeria, indeed other African countries, a lot because of the way it mismanaged the COVID-19 pandemic in not, telling the world exactly how severe this issue really was. But it's almost like reading between the lines of your op-ed. You actually were saying, beyond the COVID-19, that China does owe Africa and indeed Nigeria.
Well, within our global system, what is a basic custom is that advanced economies are perceived to have stronger government capabilities and therefore are better positioned to handle things that we call global public bads. Global public bads are, of course, things that have such negative impact and externalities on even those that had no hand in their happening. And so when you look at something like the climate change situation, Africa contributes just 1% to global gas emission, and therefore what it means is that we are the least responsible for climate variabilities. And then you look at the financial and economic crisis that happened in 2008, 2009. Africa had no hand in it. It originated from Wall Street and then Europe and the UK. Now you look at the matter of the Wuhan crisis, the health pandemic that we're dealing with, C-19. It originated from an economy that is very strong, an economy that is very powerful. And unfortunately, in most of these cases, the powerful countries end up not doing things in a way that show that they've been accountable to the rest of the world. And when they don't do things that are accountable, and they do things in a way that they don't bear any consequence for what they create, the people who suffer the most are the weak and the vulnerable. And so whether it's the climate change and the effect that it has had on Africa, it is hugely adverse, or it is the financial crisis of the 2008, 2009. It was terrible. It took Africa's average growth from about 5 to 6% down to below 2% before it began to climb up again. And now the COVID-19 pandemic has caught it so badly. Africa's economy is going to contract by as much as 4% in a matter of how many weeks that we have been through this. The unemployment that Africa is going to have is an additional 20 million jobs lost. Now, this is too significant an impact for a continent that has fragile growth. Yes, Africa has governance problems. Yes, Africa has not done particularly right in quality of policies that it sometimes, takes on itself. However, we must not excuse this bad behavior by the richer and more powerful economies. And so I am a voice out there saying we now need to innovate a mechanism through which the rich would pay penalty to the poor for robbing them of their growth and their development.
Right. Ms. Ezekwesili, I know I said it correctly that time.
You sure did. You sure did.
I'm really, I mean, we enjoyed reading your opinion piece in the Washington Post. And one thing that really stood out for me was, on the one hand, you said that, reparations should be paid, but you also gave empirical examples of how that could be done. And you said that more than $140 billion that China's government's its banks and its creditors have extended to countries in Africa should be written off. And I think that that would be a great example of China, or indeed the powers that be, being able to take a stand in helping Africa. But in your most honest personal opinion, how feasible do you think that is? How possible do you think that could actually end up happening?
Well, it is entirely possible. It depends on how much China regards itself as a possible world leader. China cannot lead the world being a rogue government. If for you to prepare yourself to be a leader of the world, there is a certain level of propriety with which you should conduct yourself. And then you must show leadership when things like this happen. The vulnerable and the poor cannot be paying for your bad behavior. And then you're silent about it, or you pretend that you are giving them aid. Africa is not asking for aid through this penalty payment, because what I have called it is a global risk burden tax. It's a tax. And so it's earned because they did not create this situation. The lack of transparency and the opacity with which China handled this meant that it had already gotten out of control. And so, the whole world is paying. But I'm saying that the poor and the vulnerable are paying disproportionately more than any other person. And so if China reckons itself to be a potential world leader, then it would give consideration to something that is evidently quantifiable. And then the second thing is that for Africa must assert itself. It is possible when Africa asserts itself. There are two countries that can be the champions of this kind of a thing and be assertive. I don't understand why African leaders are playing, what do you call it? I don't know. I don't know what kind of an attitude where you can see what's unfolding in China against even your citizens. And I haven't seen a very strong voice of condemnation from our leaders. We can't play second fiddle to China. Countries operate on the basis of equality and mutuality of interests. And so no matter what a country, for as long as a country is registered as a country under the UN Charter, that country has exactly the same rights as the other country. So we cannot be subservient to China. We must assert ourselves at a time like this. So if Nigeria and South Africa, as two formidable voices for the continent, the two largest economies, the two most powerful countries on the continent, should rally the rest of the continent to say, you know what, we want to change the rules of the game. We understand that there are people who would like to give us support, but we want to establish a principle so that there would be deterrent. If we don't have this deterrent, we will continue to have cyclical collapse of the African economy each time a powerful economy behaves recklessly.
All right. Well, you do say that there should be new rules if African leaders can actually pull resources together, come together and come up with a different template in engaging countries like China and the rich North. But you do say that voluntary international aid for Africa during this difficult time may not necessarily be the best solution. Exactly what is the best solution? And when you say that China must pay reparation for Africa, in what way? Is it just about doling out more dollars to African countries that are not guaranteed to go to the right purse, that could even be diverted? What mechanism and exactly in what way should China pay reparations to Africa?
Well, the first one and immediate one, as you did refer to earlier and stated in my article, is that between the Chinese government, its contractors, and its banks, there is some $145 billion that constitute their loans to African countries. A complete write-off of those loans would be a very important way of signaling to the world that an economy that is more than a $14 trillion economy, is actually finding its propriety and doing the right thing by the poor and the vulnerable that it has harmed. I don't want people to think that we're begging. We're not begging. We are asserting that we have been injured and that our economies have collapsed and that our people are being failed as a result of that. Therefore, you owe us a liability that must be paid. So that's one. The second part of it is that in that same article, I did state that there was going to be need for a conversation. We don't know the numbers yet, but between the Chinese, the G20, a group of nations, and the international development institutions like our Africa Development Bank, the World Bank, the IMF, regional bodies like the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, UNECA, there can be a conversation around what is the shortfall of growth that we now have as a continent, and what is it that takes us back to a path for accelerating our growth. And on the basis of that, you can calculate what kind of investment that we require. Now, as part of that kind of a conversation, the very important point you made about ensuring good governance of such new resources would then be discussed. And that, for me, means that we're going to design something that puts the citizens at the center of the decisions on what kinds of investments would give us the biggest payback in terms of rate of return, so that between investment in human capital and investment in critical infrastructure, and of course, investment in building necessary systems and institutions, by the time the citizens are part of that conversation and can also be part of the surveillance system to monitor and to evaluate the impact of such investments, it would be a change of approach. It would be a change of governance, because it would bring together the supply side of governance and the demand side of governance, and would give us better results. This might actually be the moment that we completely change the interaction between the citizens and those that govern them.
Well, we know that if we look at examples of governance and leaders of countries in terms of their response to this pandemic, there have been strong words. You've got President Trump of the United States and, of course, the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, both saying that they believe China was reckless in its handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. It seems as though you agree that China was reckless. If that is the case, could you give us examples of said recklessness?
Well, you can see that I carefully chose my words in the article, and I did say that there was lack of transparency, and it still is very evident. Only yesterday or so, China suddenly tells us that they've discovered that some 50% of the people who died as a result of the pandemic had been unreported. My goodness, how do you not report more than 50% of deaths from a disease? There is something that is murky. There's something that's opaque. There's something that says for us to scrutinize some more. So in my article, I'm sure you saw the line where I did call for China to agree to accept that an independent panel of experts should evaluate its entire response to the crisis, to the pandemic, which of course started initially as just a virus, that someone had shown manifestations of, and then the next thing clusters, and then the next thing it became an epidemic within their own environment, and then pandemic because it began to cross borders. In all of that, if China, as a very closed-in system, was trying to pretend that nothing was really phenomenally wrong, then there is a problem. There's a question to be asked, because in the bid to managing to continue to look good, a country may have compromised the lives of humanity.
All right, let's even talk about the way the Nigerian government has responded so far to the COVID-19 tragedy, whether you're talking about the palliatives that government has put in place to help the poorest of the poor. In your view, how is that going? Is it satisfactory, or does there need to be more done? And exactly what needs to be done, in a way that can protect the poorest of the poor? especially with this lockdown that many Nigerians have been crying that it is double jeopardy where their economic state has been very, very bad, and then you now throw in the lockdown that does not allow, many of them to go out and eke out a living, which to a very large extent is on a daily basis. How would you rate this, government's management of events so far?
That tells you how really difficult this pandemic is, because it creates a tension between the solution and the outcomes that you want to see. So, for example, you need to keep people away. You need to separate people in order for you to contain the spread. But in keeping people and separating people, it means that you're going to freeze the actions that people take or businesses take. So in the whole economic system, what you need are the actions of the consumers, that's the demand side, and the actions of the producers, that's the production side, the supply side. Now, if you say to people and businesses and individuals to stay home because they must, in order for you to contain the spread, the life cycle of the virus is such that it goes from individual and then to another individual, then a cluster comes up. From a cluster, if you're not managing it and containing it, you get to community infection, that is community transmission. And once you get to community transmission where you cannot trace the contact from which a person who now has the virus got it from, you are in serious trouble. So that phase of community infection is what we saw in places like Spain and in Italy and in New York and in Detroit. So when you see it, it's a terrible thing. It's a tragic thing to see. So in order for you to avoid getting to that phase, you're told you must get a lockdown. And then if you are a wealthy country, or you're a country reasonably well managed, you can actually buy compliance of your citizens for that necessary lockdown. But if you are a poor African country with 70% of your people living on subsistence, where they earn a daily wage in order to survive, then you are caught between a rock and a hard place. It's a dilemma situation. So what do you then do with that? What you do with that is to see how you can leverage every dollar, every naira that you've got in order to extend the lifespan of the period that your people can actually comply. So one of the things that happened was that some weeks ago, I thought about this and I said, oh my God, my greatest worry on COVID-19 is what would happen to the urban poor and the rural poor. We now need to think immediately how to design a way of reaching them and keeping them in the mode that we need them to be in order that this thing can pass. Unfortunately, I think that in the area of economic response to what was necessary as a health solution, we missed the mark. We missed the mark. So we're struggling. We're doing, things here and there. We're not coordinating things. We're not coherent in getting the resources to align, to leverage on themselves so that we can have greater impact. And so here you are with the federal government saying we had 2.6 million people in the social investment, is it social investment program, right? SIP, the social investment program. We are 2.6 million. That's what they said they had going in. And then they said, oh, the president says you should increase it by 1 million. I mean, that scale of increase, it just doesn't happen automatically. Otherwise, you're going to miss out so much and then waste the resources, and you would not target to the people who really need it. Now, even think in terms of 3.6 million in relation to the number of poor and vulnerable in the society. It doesn't scratch the surface. So we're having this social tension that is steering its way up because of this economic, reality that the poor and the vulnerable are facing amongst us. Now, how do we even deal with this, knowing that we are all in this together? You know, the role that communities play, so important. There's hardly any community where if resources were pooled, we would not be able to get a more positive action on the part of the ones who feel constrained to live in, to go look for food. And we missed the mark there. Oh, the president missed the mark. The president failed to mobilize.
How did we miss the mark?
The president failed to mobilize the society. He had many ways to mobilize. Do you know the authority and the power in the voice of a president to have just said to the people, you know, this war is coming. This health pandemic is a war. It's coming up against us, but we're going to all stand together. We're going to work together. I know there are certain things we're going to need the society to do. They're going to be painful things, but can I get the cooperation, the collaboration of every one of you? We need to hang together. We're not going to be able to reach everybody, but there are people that you can reach on our behalf. Please reach them. Please support them in this season. But we all need to take certain actions. We need to do our healthy thing of hygienic safety, where we wash our hands and we try to get our coughing and our sneezing done in a certain kind of way to protect others. We need to mask ourselves as is definitely necessary. Okay, we need to practice social distancing to give an arm's length as much as possible. But even more so, we just need you behind closed doors as much as possible. If the president mobilized the society, I can tell you that Nigerians, it's incredible how we respond to this kind of moral suasion when it is coming from a leader who is saying to you, we're all vulnerable, but we can hang together and we can do this together. We can win together. We missed that mark. That's what's haunting us. Some of the people that do you know how many Nigerian families are taking care of people around them? Not everybody cares to come and put something on the tweet. Not everybody cares to announce what they do. But I know that. I know how many families are taken care of. It's like an opportunity for us to be a family again, and we missed that. But at a certain level, I think that citizens are doing the best that they can do, and I can only just encourage us to do more, because for many more days.
If we go back to your point on you saying that the Nigerian president missed the mark and missed the opportunity to really take control of this pandemic and how people responded to it, I want to put a few points to you. The fact that Nigeria's Minister for Finance, Zainab Ahmed, did roll out fiscal stimulus measures to directly address the economic concerns and the fallout associated with this COVID-19 pandemic. Is what you're saying that doesn't do enough, that it barely scratches the surface of what needs to be done? What are your thoughts on that?
So Oji, the fact is, when you look at the emergency economic palliatives that have been put together, they pale in comparison to what it is that you need. We know now that most of our businesses are within the informal sector of the economy. The kind of design that you do in order to reach them, in order to just say to them, just be calm during this period. We're not going to be able to support everything, but we can definitely assure you that you're not going to walk in the park alone. All right. So there is a way that you would do that with the financial sector, both the capital market, the financial market, and then with the rest of the non-bank financial services. There has to be different groups of stakeholders for different issues that you would see a government. I saw it happening in a number of the countries. I was. You remember, I had to be away at the fellowship in Berlin, Germany. I left Germany, and a few days later, this whole thing came crashing. But if you saw the way that they were making sure that different leaders of government were meeting with different groups of stakeholders in order that they would have a response, that is concerted, a response that is very well harmonized and coordinated. It enabled people to get that sense that, hey, I'm not in this alone. Then you look at what we just said about the individual people, the poor and the vulnerable, what we would do with them. The scale of what the government can do does not add up to much. But you see, life is about leverage. It's about leverage. And there's nothing more that gives you greater scale than when government brings its own scale and then leverages the wider society. We miss that. There are certain things that, technical people alone cannot do. The president needed to take charge of this situation. You see, the technical folks at the NCDC, I am immensely glad to see that level of technical proficiency that is coming out of an institution in our country. They are doing the best that they can do and praying to God, really praying to God that we don't get to community infection. Because then we would say to ourselves, oh my God, we were in trouble. God forbid that we should get to this, because that would be terrible.
Exactly
so far, so good.
That's the prayer of every Nigerian. You do commend the NCDC, and I'm glad you mentioned that. So far, Nigeria has tested only about 9,000 people. What do you think is the missing link if this disease is not to, totally explode in our faces? What do we need to do at the federal level, at the subnational level, and of course at the local government level, in a way that everybody will actually be informed as to how grievous and serious this is?
We need to test more. If we don't test, then we don't discover. In order to detect, you must test. And when you test and you detect, you must, manage. The management side of it is going to be too much for us. We don't have the health personnel. We don't have the kind of infrastructure. We don't have the scale of technical expertise to be able to do the care part of this thing. So prevention is the lowest cost, solution for us. So what it means is that we need to test and test and test, scale our testing. And frankly, I have been so supportive of the NCDC. On my Twitter timeline, I'm spending time, when I see certain things, I go straight to them and I ask them to respond to it. I have interfaced with them as a citizen should, because frankly, this is a tough responsibility to have right now. I feel sorry for them that they are in the midst of this, but that's part of life, right? So what we can all do is to hold their hands and support them as much as possible. We have not tested enough. I mean, when you think of the percentage of our tests compared to South Africa or even Ghana, our next door neighbors, it's so insignificant.
And why do you think that is? I'm glad you mentioned those two countries. We see the example of South Africa. We see the example of Ghana. Nigeria it's falling behind in terms of testing. Why do you think there's been such a slow response? Is it because there isn't the infrastructure, or do you think there's a fear of finding out just how many people could be infected in Nigeria? Is that why we haven't been testing enough? We just have a minute left. If you could keep your answer brief. Thank you very much.
So I don't ever speculate. I hate to speculate what a motive is, because I see Nigerians, they just impugn people by thinking that, oh, this is what I think, therefore that's what it is. I don't speculate. So I wouldn't go in the area of maybe they don't want to discover that many more people are infected. What I see clearly is that we don't have, like how many laboratory centers have been accredited as good as adequate centers that would give us the right kind of quality results that can guide. Because testing is really about diagnostics. It's revealing whether there is truly a reason to worry. And we don't. So the more that the NCDC can work with private laboratory units in the country, and do public-private partnership and regulate as much as possible. Decentralize it. Don't create a bottleneck where just a few laboratories are recognized as capable of testing. And as more innovation is going into this, every day there are new ways of testing that the private sector are bringing up. We need to be at alert in terms of our procurement system so that we know which ones have been recognized and we can then, connect to those.
Okay, thank you so much, Oby Ezekwesili, co-convener of the Bring Back Our Girls campaign and former director of the World Bank, for joining us this morning on the show. We'll take a short break and return with more.